They put honey to close your battery.
Okay. Let's stop. Okay. I'd just like to add one comment to last week. We pointed out two different approaches that you might explain why Mikra Bikurim is a separate mitzvah, that it's a separate inyan or separate parashas, and we discussed the merits of the various approaches. There's another approach. There's another approach which you could postulate. I'm just going to mention it very quickly because I don't want to talk about Bikurim today. If you recall, in Sheris Chi, the Rambam lists 4 different types of mitzvahs. He lists those that are deis, those that are pulos, midas, and dibur amira. And I asked, why does the Rambam mention this? And I thought that if you had 2 mitzvahs, which even though they're one inyan, but if one is a maisa, the other is a dibur, so that itself would make it 2 mitzvahs. So what you have in Mikra Bikurim is you have the maisa of the havor, and you have the dibur Mikra Bikurim. So maybe that's the reason. The problem with that approach and the whole idea is the Rambam Sheris Yud Beis, in one of the mitzvahs that have a lot of chalokim, he mentions chalitza. And he says that in the Seder of chalitza, there's amira. So l'cheira, if you would take this very seriously, the amira should have been a separate mitzvah as opposed to the ma'aseh chalitza. We don't do that. So the question is, maybe the whole idea is wrong. How to play this out? That was just an idea that can help you think. Okay, now let's do challah. VaMitzvah HaKuf Lamed Gimel. HaMitzvah Sholosh U'Shloishim U'Meya. Hi shetzivonu lahafrish hachallah. Mikol, now I'm using the translation which is closer to the text. In Ibn Tibon it says Mikol Yisasechem, and the text seems to point, at least the Arabic, Mikol Isa V'litna L'Kayim. So there's a Hafrosha and a Nesina. Lahafish Achala Mikol Isa. Not sure exactly what he means by that, and what does he want to be called, Isa? Okay, that's just it. Mikol Isa v'litna. So here, the Rambam was Masada this after the Matonos Atruis Ba'aretz, but after Vidui Maisa u'Mikra Bikurim. So a priori, you should have decided this before. I mean, if you assume, you have to ask yourself, well, you want to assume that there's some type of seder in the Rambam. So if you assume there's some type of seder, so it could be the Rambam wanted to stress because Mikra Bikurim, Vidui Maisa and Mikra Bikurim depend upon Peiros Eretz Yisrael. And here, we're ready to have a mitzvah which doesn't depend upon Peiros Eretz Yisrael, but an Isa, which became an Isa in Eretz Yisrael, even though it was Peiros Chutz La'aretz. And that's the Rambam's Mishnah Challah, beginning of second parak, Macholis Tanoim. The Rambam in Perek Hey, V'chas Bikurim Alochavav, Peiros Chutz La'aretz, Shenichnesu La'aretz, Chayovim B'challah. U'Peiros Ha'aretz Yotzel Chutz La'aretz, P'tuin, Shnei Ma Shani Mevi Eschem Shoma. Shoma To Chayovim, Vein Al Peiros Ha'aretz, U'Vein Al Peiros Chutz La'aretz. So it means the mechayiv is the Isa. And Isa of Eretz Yisrael is chayiv. And the Rambam puts it after Mikul Bikurim to say there's something different over here. And the difference is it doesn't depend upon Peiros Eretz Yisrael. So, someone will come and Reish Lages, first of all, is not totally in Eretz Yisrael, therefore it's later. As the Ram says in Perek Tes of Hilchos Bikurim, Aloha Aleph, Mitzvas Aseh litin kol zavech behema tehera l'koyim, hazor v'chayim v'akeva, u'mitzvah zu noheges v'chulei u'b'chol mokum bein ba'eretz, bein ba'oretz, bein b'chutz la'oretz. So, Reishis Hagez l'choyer is later, okay? However, there's a problem because Vidui Ma'aser is also on Chala. The Ram and Perek Yud Aleph of Hilchos Ma'aser Shenim et Ravoy Uminayin Sheino Yochol his Vades Ad Sheitzi Kol Matonu Shnem Biat HaKodesh Min HaBayis HaKodesh Ze Ma'aser Sheni V'net Ravoy Kol Kodesh Min HaBayis Ze Chala She'amatonu Shel Kohanim Babayis. So I'm not sure how difficult that is, because the Ika Vidui is a Ma'aser Sheni Bikurim, which are Gedalim in Eretz Yisrael. As the Ram says in Hilchos Bikurim, in Hilchos Bikurim, in Hilchos Ma'aser Sheni, V'net Ravoy Perek Yirav V'loch Yudalit, Mi she'ein lo yel Ma'aser Sheni bovad misvada. Sheika vidu yemaasehu. V'chein im lo hoy lo yel bikurim bovad misvada. Shenem bi'at hakodesh horishon shu bikurim. Avu mi she'ein lo yel truma b'fnei atzmo eino misvada. She'ein shu metuna vidui el b'chal shamatonis. And chala l'chera is certainly not worse than truma. So the ika vidui maaser is on mitzvah tulis boas. So then to say that Baruch Hashem, I think is okay. Now, the word lahafish achala, at least the going, you have to really work on this. I haven't done enough research on this, but the going clearly says that the word chala being used to talk about the matana is Lashon HaMishnah. Lashon HaMikra is Truma. And that the Goyin says in your day, Siman Shin Chav Ches, Siv Beis, they must Truma, Moshe said, Ninu Truma, Ubalashon HaMikra, Chala Nikra HaIsa. Chala is the Isa. Chala is Blulois. Chala's blue is referring to the Isa. It's Bolu, the only way Chala blue is not talking about Fosh's Chala, but how make Yetzibah. Aber B'lashon HaMishnah Nikra Chala B'chol Mokoim. That's the Matana. But the Rambam always seems to say, both here, the Minyan HaKotze, the Protei HaMitzvos, it's always Lahafish Chala L'Koyin. And Hilchos Bikurim, Perek Yud, Perek Hei, Aloch Aleph, Mitzvah Aseh Lahafish Tchuma Min HaYisa L'Koyin. There, it's not 100% clear, but here he clearly is talking about Chala. I'm not sure if it's just a Lashon HaMishnah actually means that that's Pshat and Pasuk. I can't tell you. Then he does something. And first of all, he says, Mikol Isa, but he doesn't tell you, he doesn't give you a clue of what constitutes an Isa. He doesn't tell you when it's called an Isa, what the Shiur Isa Chai V'Chala, what the Shiur Chala Yachti Mafresh Min Isa. So there's no reason to discuss it over here, because all these things are Protei Dinei Mitzvahs Chala. And their places in Mishnah Torah, not in Sefer Mitzvah. So I'm only has to tell you there's a Mitzvah L'Hafish Chala Mino Isa, and then he's finished really. But he adds one more thing, which is very important. He says, V'litno l'koyin. V'litno l'koyin means there's a mitzvah sina. And the Rambam l'chor is equating this to the mitzvahs which he discusses in Shurish Yud Beis. Like he says, Reishis Hagez is Hafrosh and Nesina. And he says, Ma'aser Rishon is Hafrosh and Nesina. And Chala is the same. The only problem over here is the Rambam in no way postulates Nesina. He only postulates Hafrosha. He quotes a pasuk, Reishis Arisei Seichem Chala Trimu Truma. In the Minyan HaKotze, in the Protei HaMitzvah in Hilchos Bikurim, the nusach of the mitzvah is lahafrish chal l'koyin. We don't know whether that's the purpose of the afrosha. That should be afrosha l'koyin, or he really means in the scene l'koyin. It's not clear. The Sifri in Parshas Korach, asher yitanu ze hazroa v'l'chayim v'akeva l'Hashem zu chala. So the Sifri seems to say the mitzvah nesina, but you would have expected that the Rambam should have made reference to it. He does something like that in Ma'aser Rishon. Besides quoting the pasuk for Afrosha, he quotes the pasuk for nesina. Here he doesn't for some reason. You could have said that since it's called truma, chala truma truma, then it should have the same dinim of truma and have a nesina. But that is not very convincing, because here we're interested in making a separate mitzvah, not part of the mitzvah of truma and nesina. We're trying to have a mitzvah of hachala and afrosh and nesina, which is a separate mitzvah, and you can't do that just by the name of truma. See, here's just a difficulty in the text. We can live with it, but that's what it is. Then it continues. Ukfa hisba'ar u'mishpatei mitzvah zo kulam meseches chala meseches ola ve'ein ochayva min ha'teira ela be'eretz Yisrael levad. That the Rambam in Perek Hever is Bekum Alochehei ein chayov b'chala min ha'teira ela be'eretz Yisrael levad. Shenema v'hoye b'acholchem milechem oretz. Very good. However, he continues, and he mentions something new over here. He says you require bias kulchem for the chiyuv. And he continues with Zman shekol Yisrael shom, shenema b'voachem bias kulchem v'lo bias miksosam. The fikol chala b'zman hazeh, afilu b'mei Ezra, is only midivreim. And in Trumas and Maisi does the same thing. In Mishnah Torah, in Sefer Mitzvah, he doesn't do it. The Rab Chaim, the Beis Halevi quotes him in Chele Gimel, Siman Aleph, discussing the inyan of Bias Chulchem and Chala and in Truma and Maisa. He points out that they're different. However, the Rambam only mentions the idea of Kol Yeshveho Leho or Bias Kulchem in Minyan HaMitzvos. He only mentions it in Yovel. So I could have imagined that even as a din of Bias Kulchem, it's a Tanai. but it's not really the Etzma Mitzvah, and the Etzma Mitzvah depends on marriage. So we have to understand it, but there's no mention of all this. The only thing that's mentioned is the Kol Yoshvel Lev Yishrim Robim, and that he mentioned in Yodel. Okay, now let's get started. Mitzvah Ha'arba Ushloishim Umeya. He shetzivonu lahafkir kol ma shetatzmiach ha'oretz b'shnas hashmita. The lashon lahafkir is Ibn Tibin and Kapach. However, the proper translation of the Arabic word is more lahashmit ulahazniach. This gives you a very interesting insight over here. The word lahashmit ulahazniach, it doesn't say there's a mitzvah to be mafkir bepeh, but the mitzvah is lahazniach ulahashmit. So it could be is that there's afkat de malka. It means that the hefki shvius is lachmona afkare. It's memela. But the din lahashmit lazniach, the mitzvahs nihug, I should be noyeg as if it's hefka. There's nothing, I don't have to go out and say mufka, mufka, mufka. It doesn't say that over here. But the mitzvah is lazniach ulahafkir, means to be noyeg with it, with the afkata de malka. So then, it's very possible that the mitzvah of shvius, of hefker shvius, is very similar to tmura. The mitzvah of tmura, the kedushas tmura, is memela. Vohoyehu is mosiyeh kodesh. But the mitzvah, the kodesh, the mitzvah which is on us, incumbent on us, is not that we should be makdish it, but we should be noyeg with the dinei carbon of tmura, of the kedushas tmura. Similarly, in shvius, the mitzvah is to be noyeg with the peiros hagedelim ba'aretz, as if they're hefker. And that's the mitzvah, lahashmit ulazniach. Then what are you supposed to call ma shetatzmiach ha'oretz? Everything which the earth produces. This term is a little bit odd. I don't think you should take the words literally. It doesn't mean everything. It means everything which eventually, which is on its way to have Tusha Shvius. Even if the Hefka is prior to Tusha Shvius, as the Chazon Ish assumes, okay. However, it's only because the peiros are eventually going to become Kedusha Shvius. Okay? So then the way the Rambam phrases it, Kol ma shetatzmiach ha'oretz b'shnas hashmita, you get the impression that any vegetation, which I don't believe is a proper thing. That there's no mitzvah to be mafkir the vegetation. The mitzvah is to be mafkir those peiros, even if you're mafkir from betchila, okay? But it's only because they become shvius, they become tusha shvius. Then the hifkir, it's interesting. Here, hifkir tzmich, it says, the v'hifkir, he says, kol ma shetatzmiach ha'oretz, it says lahafkir, v'hifkir simche ad moseinu kulam l'kol echod. Now I say l'kol echod, first of all, we'll get back to it for, because that is the translation of the Arabic. That's exactly the translation of the Arabic. Whatever others say, or kapach hakol, then he gives the whole drasha why he says it, but I don't see it in the words. Here, kapach lahafke kol ma shetzmicha shehitzmicha oisei adoma b'shnas hashmita ulahatir. It's a different Arabic word, but it's the mashmos of lahazniach ulahashmit. Simche kol kinyonenu lakol. Here, I just like to tell you something, okay? Not only see, if you say l'kol odom, lakol could be hu lakol or l'kol echod. The question is, what about behema? Because it is clear in the Yerushalmi, in Perek Vav, Mishnah Aleph, and the Rash there, that the Machlokes of Yochanan is a Machlokes of Yochanan. The Shlok is not negated to us, but everyone agrees Hefke Shvius is for behema. And if I don't let the behema avail itself of Shvius, I'm only because I'm protecting the Kedusha Shvius. That if the behema comes by itself, I have to let the behema eat it, and I'm not to remind me of the behema there. But the soda is mufka for the behema. So it's not clear to me, but it may be that the Mitzvas Aseh of lahashmid lahatir might include for behema also, kol echod. Or that's only the afkata de malka and has nothing to do with our niud. Okay, now, next. And the Ram says, V'hu amra yis'aleh v'ashvi'is tishmetena unetashta. Tishmetenu tashta, that's lahashmit lazniach. V'loshna mechilta b'shima yochoi. Here's where things get very interesting, okay? These are simple issues that I dealt with. Now, things are getting interesting. V'haloi hakerem v'hazayis b'chlal hoya. Hakerem v'hazayis b'chlal hoya. V'lomo yotzo lahakish elov. Ma hakerem shu basei v'oiv mo b'lo yisaseh. Kach kol shu basei oiv mo b'lo yisaseh. See here, before we get into Bechlal, what the pshat of this mechilta is, the Rambam is quoting this, that to tell you it's a raya, that it's a Mitzvas Aseh. Because you could have said it's just a state that that's a din, but there's no Mitzvah Aseh. It's not an amal. That's something we're supposed to do. And the answer is, it clearly says, Kach kol shehu ma kerem miyuchad shu b'aseh v'oivim lo b'loisaseh. And there's an aseh by kerem, and this aseh by kerem is Hashvius Tishmeten Natashto. The Inyan Zehamaya Amama, the interpretation of this Mechilta Masha Sape or Masha Asbir. The Ram is going to explain. And here we start. Zesha Omroi. The Torah said, Vashvius Tishbeten Natashto, Koilil Hefke Kol Mash Yitzmach Min Oretz. Bashon Hashvius. So here he's very clear about what Mash Yitzmach is. Min Anovim, Vateinim, very prolific and graphic. Min Anovim, Min Vateinim, Vazesim, Vafasekim, Voimoinim, Vachitim, Vasairim, Vizulazeh. All different meaning. Very prolific, very graphic. Hine, Hoidia, and Kappa, I think is better, is Nimsa. Nimsa, not Nehine Hoidia. Nimsa, Shashmotas Hakol, everything. Mitzvas Aseh. Ve'achkach Pirit, Ve'omo, Kain Ta'aseh, because the Pasuk, in Shmos, Kain Ta'aseh, L'kalmecho, L'zeisecho. Hashvius Tishbetenu L'tashto, says Kain Ta'aseh, L'kalmecho, L'zeisecho. So what is that to repeat? Kain Ta'aseh, L'kalmecho, L'zeisecho. V'zehu b'chlal. That's Ibn V'elehein. I guess that's much better because it's referring to the two things of Zayis and Kerem. B'chlal kol ma sheyitzmach min haaretz hatshvius tishmeten l'tashto. The omnon bo in Ibn Tivin, but better probably Kapach says ela noima ze hatzivui b'kerem u'b'zayis bilvad. It doesn't express itself in the Mitzvas Aseh, but expresses itself in the Lois Aseh. Ba'avur shebo ba'kosav ashora b'yichud mila'aseh tvuas hakorem. And this tvuas hakorem is a separate lav by kerem. V'u omroi v'es invein zirecha loiv simso. וכמוי שהכרם שהפקירו מצווס עשה מניוסי מצווס לא יעשה. There's an ashora which is לא יעשה. כן, כל מה שיצמח בשנס, בשון השביעי שיסבויר שהפקירו בעשה, יהיה מניוסי ולא יעשה. Now here, the Arabic word is yikon, which should be yiyeh, and that's the proper translation that the Kapach does. Hine, I'm not sure exactly why Ibn Tivin does it, but there's a lois aseh. So l'chayr, what it means is a parallel structure. Wherever there's an aseh of ashmata, there's a lois aseh also. Even though there's no explicit ashara by Zayis. Aseh v'loisaseh. V'din zeh. V'din shal. Peiros echod. Hine hisboye mikol ma shekodem ki hashmotas gedulei shviyis mitzvaseh. Okay. That's all he's interested, okay? That's why he quotes the whole thing. But in the discussion, there's an amazing thing. An amazing, amazing thing. What he's done is equated the Aseh and the Lois Aseh. And you have to interpret from the context over here that not only is the Aseh lahazniach or lahashmit, but the Lois Aseh is to refrain from being lahashmit or lahazniach. Otherwise, we don't understand what the Ram is talking about. In fact, the din is the isa betzires inve nizirecha loy sivso is betzira keder haba'alim, to act in the harvest as a baal, as the owner of the property, of the owner of the produce. And there's an asay to be v'nasnich lahashmit, and there's a lav in the harvest to act as a ba'alim. And that's what he says in the Minyan HaMitzvos in Reish Chav Gimel. He shares hilnu Minyan HaMitzvos itself. He shares hilnu me'asoif kol ma she'atzmicho ilonos min ha'peiros gam ki mishon ha'shvius k'moi she'nesaf peiroseim b'chol shona avol nasa oisei b'shinui laheiros shehu hefker. In other words, the lav is to do it in a way that's indicative that it's not hefker, and the lav requires you to do it in a way that is hefker. So it means then there's a parallel, it's a mirror. The ashara and the asera mirror, and that's the pshat in the mechilta. That the same way there's an asay on everything, the lois say, even though it's expressed in terms of kerem, it's also on everything. Now, the question is, l'cheira, there's something odd here, because you would have expected there's one lois aseh which takes care of rimoinim and aforsaken, but also of chit and seira, correct? The problem is there are two lavim in Minyan HaMitzvos. There's one lav of Reish Chav Gimel, which is inve nezirecha loy sivso, which he says mashi yatzmichu hoilonos min ha'peiros. Okay, and then there's Reish Chav Beis, which is svir ketzilcha loy sikso, which is referring to Ktsira. It doesn't mean there's an Isaac Maisa Ktsira. And that the Ram says, He she's hinu mikso mash tatzmicha oretz me'atzmo b'shon ha'shvius k'mo sheniksa b'chol shon v'chulei v'omo yis'al esvir ktsircha lo yisikso eino lo yitsa boy shelo yiksa boy oisa klal ki hu kvar omar v'hoisa shabas ha'oretz lochem le'ocho v'ulam yirtza boy lo yisiksa oisai k'mo she'iksa oisai k'mo she'tiksa oisai b'chol shona Ela kimi sheyiksa dova shehu hefka b'li hachona ebilti tiku. So here also, that's a very odd thing. The kerem and zayis, from looking at the mechilta, you would get the impression that the ashara of kerem applies to everything, And the Rambam is very clear that the ashara of kerem we applies to all ilanos, and ashara of ktsira requires to all produce that grows from the ground itself, not from trees. Which is odd. That you have an aseh, which is kol sakol, and two separate lois asehs, and that l'chera, at least we understand what the Rambam is doing. We understand what the Mechilta is doing, but the Rambam goes out of his way to start giving a graphic list. He says, "Min hanovim v'ateinim v'azeisim v'afasekim v'rimoinim v'achitim v'aseirim," to tell you that the aseh is by everything, as opposed to the lavim. But how the Mechilta is read, that it goes to everything, and that Zayis is just another example of Ilonis, it doesn't mean everything, is a little odd. But that l'chor is why the Rambam is being so graphic over here. Now, the Rambam in Mishnah Torah has made an about face to this approach. And first of all, before you start medayking the words, you see it from the way he organizes Mishnah Torah. Because logically, if it's the way you would assume it's Ina from Hefka, you should mention the mitzvah of Hefka, and then mention these lavim that you shouldn't violate a lav and do something antithetical to Hefka. Okay? But the Rambam mentions these lavim before he mentions the mitzvah of Hefka. And we'll see that's a lot more than that. The Rambam mentions this mitzvah in Halacha Aleph in Perek Dal, Halacha Beis, and the mitzvah of Hefker is only Halacha Dal. Mitzvas Aseh la'ashmit kol ma'ashet toitzi oretz b'shvius. Okay, so then it gives you the clue. This might not have anything to do with Hefker. Let's just see Lashon Rambam and see exactly what the Rambam be our teacher. He says like this in Perek Dal Halacha Aleph, v'zeh shenama nema esviach k'tzilcho lo yisikso shelo yikso k'derech shekoitze b'chol hashana. Here it could be anything. V'im kotza k'derech hakoitzum loike kigein shekotza kol hasoda v'hemet kri v'dosh baboko. He does the harvest in a wholesale fashion. He harvests in the same way that you harvest a whole field instead of piecemeal. And he doesn't mention a word about bilis. And then he says there's another aspect, O shekotza lavodas haaretz kamo shebi'alma. There are two parts of this, two aspects. It's either a ktsira, like a harvest, the way you harvest yearly, or avodas haaretz. Elokaitze ma'at, which is very different than you could do ma'at and do the whole field. You might have a problem with Mitzvas Aseh, but in the lav you have no issue. Elokaitze ma'at v'chayvet v'oichel. Then in B'tzira, ha'peru sheyoitzi ho'ilon b'shvius lo ya'asfem kederech she'osef b'chol shana shene'emar v'es invei nizirecha lo yisivso v'im botza la'avodas ha'ilon o shebotza kederech ha'beitzrim lo yiketz. That's the same thing as he did by Ktsira. Then, 2 halachas later, he talks about the idea of Hefker. And there, he says like this, Halach of Dalet. Mitzvas Aseh lahashmit kol ma shetoitzi oretz b'shvius, shenema b'shvius l'shtenu tashta. V'chol noel kalmoi oisog sodei b'shvius bitul mitzvas Aseh. That's clear. You don't let people in. V'chein im osaf kol peiroisov l'teich beisai. He also violates it. He talked about the Azara just before in Chavbeis and Aleph. He's not talking about an Azara. He's talking about a Bitul Aseh. Because Kederech Baalim is only Nis Aseh. The Lav is Kederech HaKeitzrim, Kederech HaBeitzrim. Is the whole field together. Or Avodas HaSodah. But the Isa say, V'yeshalav v'tech beisai, ma'at kederech shemevim in a hefker. Chomesh. V'chein im osav kol peiloisav v'tech beisai. And it's only in Isa say, the bitul asay, el yafki akol, v'yad akol shoven, b'chol mochem shnem v'ochli avyoni amecho. V'yeshalahovi v'tech beisai. מעט כדרך שמביאים מן ההפקר. חומש כדי כדי שמן, 15 כדי יין, הביא יסם מזה מותר. So it's only ביטול עשה. Also is very interesting. This seems to be, he hasn't told you what exactly happened. There's not only a mitzvah say lahashmit and a problem with noel beisoi, but to differentiate between various segments of society is also a problem. And he says, Eliyavke hakol, v'yad hakol shovin, b'chol mokin. Not sure it's another asay or it's telling you more dinim. It's come to be mashlim dinei mitzvah, but there's a separate din in this hefker that it should be yad hakol shavim, and this is what in minyan HaMitzvos seems to be the ashara to be kaitze kederech baalim, ketzir kederech baalim. In Mishnah Torah is a bitul aseh. The lav is something else. B'chal is a derech hakeitzrim of a harvest on mass scale. Now, next. Ukvar. Hine is boy mikol ma shekodem. Ki ashmot d'lishvius mitzvas aseh. Ukva hisboy mishpatei mitzvazo b'mesech shvius. V'hi eino chayva min haTorah elo leperis Eretz Yisrael bovad. And he's alluding that there's a d'Rabbanan, but min haTorah is only Eretz Yisrael. This I'm not sure. You see, in Perik Hey, Perik Dal Lochav Hey says Ein Shvius Ram Mishnah Torah and Shvius Shvita B'Yovel Ein Shvius No Hegis Ela Be'Eretz Yisrael Bovad Ken Mishtivol Ela Oretz No Hegis Bein V'nei Abayis Bein Shelo B'Vnei Abayis. So he's talking about Shvius. He doesn't tell you what he's referring to. So I would assume since it's Stam, it's referring not only to the mitzvah of Shvis Aseh, which we'll see about that later, but also to the mitzvah of Hefker, of the Hashmit Laznir. He says, Tam, that all the mitzvah of Shvis depend on Eretz Yisrael. Okay, here I guess we'll get started. I'm not sure if we'll finish this. Mitzvah Kuf Lamed Heya, Mitzvah Achomesh Ushleishim Umeya. He shetzivonu lishbois. Lishbois me'avodas ha'oretz. Bashon Shvius. Lishbois is referring to the individual, to the person. He is supposed to refrain from doing avodas haaretz. Me and a mitzvah kotze is the same thing. Lishbois me avodas haaretz. Shneim b'chosh v'chotze tikso. Tishbois b'chosh v'chotze tishbois. Hilchos Shmita v'yoyvo perek aleph halacha aleph Mitzvas Aseh lishbois me avodas haaretz avodas ha'ilon b'shana shvius. However, in Proteg mitzvahs, in Hilchos Shmita v'yoyvo, the Ram says the mitzvah is not in the Gavra, but it's a mitzvah of Shvis Haaretz. It's on the Oretz itself. He says, Shetishbois ha'oretz b'shvius mimalachta. The Oretz should not do malacha. This is the pashtus of the Gemara Avodah Zarah on Tesvav Beis. Omer Rabba midomi hosem ein odem mitzuva al shvis behemtoi. B'shvius hocha odem mitzuva al shvisas behemtoi b'Shabbos. There's no shvisas behemtoi on shvius, but there's shvisas behemtoi on Shabbos. Omer Abaye v'chol heicha di odem mitzuva also v'hosoder di odem mitzuva al shvisas sodehu b'shvius. Very explicitly, the shvisa, the aseh is on the shvisa oretz. That you find in Rashi Divrei Maschil al Odom Mitzuva Shvis Sadeu Shnas Shabbos and Yil Oretz Toisa Bochonon Ritva Raivid Piskei Riaz Avodah Zarah Perek Aleph Halacha Daled Ois Tes V'lo Yaski Sadeu B'Shvis Afil L'Goy. You shouldn't rent your soda out to L'Goy. Why? You're not doing anything. Shenema Shabbos Shabbos and Yeh La'oretz. It's a very different mitzvah. The mitzvah is on the Oretz, or the mitzvah is on the Gavra. If the mitzvah is on the Gavra, if you give it to a guy, you have no problem. You understand yourself. The Melechas Goy in Kol Din HaTorah, the Zisa Melacha, is nothing. It's like a Melacha de Memela. But if there's an Isa, it must be that there's a Din Shvis Skalka b'Shvis. And it's like Shvis's Kalim, Beishamai Shvis's Kalim, that the Kalim should not do a Melacha on Shabbos. Minchas Chinuch points this out in Mitzvah Kuf Yud Beis. Mikdash David in Siman Nun Tes, Sif Kotten Zayin, they were Masa Gasim, it's like this. V'choshen Neteya Erev Shvius, V'niklata B'Shvius, Nehei, the Asiyas Malacha B'Shvius Leka, the Eno Eise Shum Malacha B'Shvius, Mikol Mokoim, or Aseh, the B'Shofso Oretz, Ika. The Akarka Naasis Malacha B'Shvius. The Klitas Hazera and Shvius is a problem. Ukmoi b'Shvis's Kalim b'Shabbos leBeishamai. The Oma ne afkui mafkele. The Afagav shehilig me'ev Shabbos. Mikomoko and kima deika Shvis's Kalim. Af she'achkach doilik me'elov is also. Who adin shenota. The Klita have Yizriya mamish. But l'cheira, the tzmichas ha'ilon is not a melacha. The fact the tree grows on Shvius is not a problem. The problem is the klita. There's no melacha of growing by itself. The melacha is because there's a zriya in the karka. The klita is a zera. However, the Sefer Shemitah, the Chazon Ish, and the Aviezi don't interpret like this. L'chaira, if you have an otzitz nokuf, or you see me, let's say, for example, if you have, for example, according to Beis Shammai, an otzitz she'eno nokuf, okay, and the zera is growing on Shabbos, you don't have to mafkir the otzitz. That's not a malacha, and I don't think it will be by shvius. Okay? Whatever it is, there's no reflection of this Gemara in Avodah Zarah, both in the Rambam and Sefer HaMitzvos and Minyan HaKotzer and in Hilchos Shvius. Only in the Protei Mitzvahs. Now, I'm not sure, you see, here in Kapach, I'm not sure, you see, here I just have to do some more research on this, because Kapach translates it like this. Hatzivu shel stavinu lahashbis avodas po'adom b'shana shvius. What's lahashbis? It means to make sure that the sod is not doing something, and then it might come out to the Gemara with the Zohar, or it's something else. Okay. Now, the Rambam quotes, he says, let's say, B'shana Shvius, v'omra yis'aleh b'chorish u'v'kotze tishbois. The first thing that he quotes is b'chorish and v'kotze tishbois, which we will see. Let me just get you, I think we'll deal more with the issues next week. Let me just give you something to get yourself oriented, okay? B'chorish and v'kotze tishbois, it's not clear whether it's referring to Shabbos or to Shvius. The Rambam takes a double portion over here that is referring to Shvius. Okay? And this is the Aseh. Then he says, Ukvar nichpal ze hatzivui kama pomim v'omar Shabbos Shabboson yel oretz ukvar kodam lanu omrom hai Shabboson asehu. So this is amazing. So I ask you, where do you think this was mentioned by? Hai Shabboson asehu. It's Rav Ashi's memory in many places that the Shabboson, which is formulated by Yontif, is a Mitzvas Aseh. So comes the Rambam and quotes this and says, oh, Shabbos Shabboson yil oretz. There's a Mitzvas Aseh by Shvius. V'rayim doch Rav Ashi. Okay, that is point number 2. V'omu ayis'aleh gam kein v'shov so'oretz Shabbos Lashem. Okay. V'ayisbor mishpatei mitzvah gam kein b'seches Shvius ve'en chavosam min ha'Torah ela be'eretz Yisrael. Okay, very nice. Now, we discussed, and that will just for a few minutes, and then we'll pick all this up next week. We discussed in Hashmota, in Lazniach, Ulahashmit, the Someich min Oretz, relationship between Naseh and Elois Aseh. Okay? a similar relationship. There is a similar relationship in Shvius also. In Melacha and Shvius. How do I know this? Okay, before we get fancy, let's do things we've seen already, and then we go to things you might not have seen. Because if you learn Shiur Shishi, you saw it. Let's go to Shiur Shishi. Here it is. Da shadovo echod yeboy aseh. This one thing, it's a unison, it's something. Dovo echod yeboy aseh v'lo yisaseh al echod mishlosh parim. The three ways you can have an aseh v'lo yisaseh, and they're all in minyan mitzvahs. O shetia, this is the I'm interested in the first case. O shetia asiyah misriyemes Mitzvas Aseh, is to do X, v'havoris aleo, and to do the opposite of X is an ashola, Mitzvas Aseh. And what are the examples? Shabbos, to go in Shabbos. There's an Aseh to be Shevis Meloch on Shabbos. And there's Hazor to do Meloch on Shabbos. V'yontif, v'hashmota. Shasias Melocha, Vashmita. It should be Vashmita. Vashmita. Shasias Melocha, Bohem Mitzvahs Lois Aseh. Vashvisa Bohem Mitzvahs Aseh. Kamochi is Boya. So it means there's a lav to do Melocha, and there's an Aseh that obligates me to as a kiyum of refraining from Melocha. Okay. The next question you have to ask yourself. For example, when we talk about Shabbos and Yontif, there's a priori symmetry, or it's dova echod. There's some type of relationship. The aseh, the lois aseh is on lamates meloches, and the aseh is also on lamates meloches. The question is, when you read this and you look at Mishnah Torah, that there's an aseh to be shoves mikol meleches adomo meleches haaretz, should one assume that this aseh is limited to Zmira and Zriya? Because the lavim in the Torah, they refer to avodas haaretz are Zmira and Zriya. And it says, the Lashon is, Shetzivu lishbois me avodas haaretz. It's very, very vague, and it seems to clearly point to all melachos. So the question which we're going to have to deal with, we'll see, Achrenim talk about it, Diukim and Rambam, Halacha Aleph, and Beis, and Gimel, and Hey, and Yud. You can look at the Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Asid. You can look at the Moed Daf Gimel, and you can do your homework and look. And the Mitzvahs Lois Aseh with Reish Chav, whatever in Zriya and in Zmira, and try to understand what's happening. I think part of the clue would be looking at the next mitzvah of the Kidashtim by Yovel, and what that includes and what that mitzvah is. And I'm interested in terms of this discussion is not the Rambam's discussion in Mishnah Torah in Perek Yud Halacha Tesvav and Perek Yud Halacha Aleph, but more so in the way he's playing this out in Sefer HaMitzvos. So this really is a discussion in Mitzvah Hashem for next week, and this is your homework, and Mitzvah Hashem will pick it up.